Good morning, everyone. This is Doug. This is a continuation of our episode series about the history of Christmas by Frederick Conybeare. And he did this work in 1899, and it was part of the American Journal of Theology. This episode is going to be 100% just reading the article, various excerpts. And again, I'll make the article available for anyone who wants to see it. It'll be in our public domain list if you have that list. Anyway, let's begin. The title of this part 3 is Christmas was invented in mid-300s post-Nicaea, post-325 AD, to push out Epiphany, which is the celebration as a holiday amongst Christianity in the earliest church till it started to get wiped out in the 2nd and 3rd centuries. That was Jesus' baptism was celebrated. In particular, the expression, this day begotten thee, was emphasized that God Yahweh spoke over the head of Jesus at that baptism in accounts that were both in Matthew and Luke until at least 383 AD, when there was a conflict between Augustine and Bishop Faustus. Bishop Faustus saying you can't believe in Matthew and Luke and believe in the Nicene Creed at the same time because it refutes Matthew and Luke refute the Nicene Creed that Jesus was eternally begotten. Instead, he was begotten as a son of God at his baptism. That's what it said, even as of 382 AD, and Augustine couldn't refute that. And he suggested only that maybe he heard it said that there was codices in Greek that didn't have it in Luke, but he didn't say he saw it and he didn't claim it was true. He just said he heard about that. Anyway, the point is this is all, but those passages had to be driven out of the Bible and were removed to make room for the other approach. Christmas, he was born God. He was born as Son of God, and so on and so forth. Let's continue now. So let's listen to his account. Christmas Day on December 25th is one of the latest of the feasts commemorative of Jesus Christ instituted by the Church, for it only began to be observed toward the end of the 4th century. That's the end of the 300s. John Chrysostom, who lived at the end of the 300s, has left us a homily preached at Antioch, which helps to fix the exact date at which it was kept first in the important Christian center of Antioch. That's in Syria, by the way, modern Syria. His name for the feast is the birth of Christ after the flesh. It is not yet 10 years, he says, since this day became manifest and known to us. So the birth after the flesh would be from Mary, right? That would be the flesh. Okay, so 10 years before the end of the 300s would be 390. So sometimes no later than 390, and it could be any time earlier than that, which would have been a lifetime of Chrysostom. And his working life was basically from the 370, 380 period up to into the early 400s. So we would have to say this is somewhere in that range, and we're going to get a precise date in a second. But we know for a fact it didn't exist prior to this period of time, in the late 300s. Now, Conybeare is going to make his own comment on what he would estimate to date. Thus, we know that the Christmas, or Feast of the Birth of Christ, was observed in Antioch, the oldest Christian center outside Jerusalem, not earlier than 376 AD, that 10 years later it was far from being unanimously accepted by Christians. Indeed, if we bear in mind that Chrysostom was an advocate of the new feast, we can infer from his language that Eastern Christendom was extremely opposed to it. He also implies that it was celebrated in the western half of the world, bordering the Mediterranean, before it gained a footing in the eastern half. An Armenian writer of the 11th century records, we know not on what authority, that it was first observed in the imperial circles in Constantinople, that's in Turkey today, AD 373, having been invented much earlier by Artemon, the heretic in Rome. He says this is to England. In our own islands, we have an interesting record that the Christian feast of Christmas coincided in date with an earlier pagan festival. For the Venerable Bede, that's a monk who lived in England, tells us in the 600s, by the way, tells us in his work, De Temporum Ratione, Capitulo, or chapter 13, that, quote, the Anglican peoples began the year on December 25th, on the day on which we now celebrate the birth of the Lord. And they then called the very night, which is now sacrosanct to us, by the vernacular name of Modranet, that is the night of mothers, by reason we suspect of the ceremonies which they conducted on it, watching its length. In Italy also, and in Latin countries generally, the new Christmas of the end of the 4th century coincided with an older pagan festival. The Saturnalia, when the slave was for once as good as his master, lasted from December 17th to the 24th, to be followed on December 25th by the Brumalia or Bruma, the feast of the shortest day, the first of the new sun, the last of the old. As Ovid says, and this is in Latin, I'll just translate it for you. Winter came first, but now the old year passes as the latest sun arises. So that is the date of December 25th is when you had this shortest day before, and now this is the beginning of the next cycle, which is where the days get longer, every day shorter periods of time. Short periods of time keep being added day by day until you get to the summer. Let's continue. Next, he says, the Christians of the farther east, round about Edessa, that's an important center of early Christianity. Probably this is where the Ebionite early church had to flee during the time period of the siege of Jerusalem. And that's why you have, this is the capital of the Syriac language, and it became a Christian kingdom in the early 100s. Let's begin again. The Christians of the farther east, round about Edessa, who rejected the new Christmas, accused their, so this is going to be more conservative, right? Accused their co-religionists of Rome of idolatry and sun worship because they chose December 25th for their new festival. And it is likely enough that the old sun worship lived on as an integral element in the new cult. Let's continue. The Persian Christians who followed Mani's revelation, he's a guy who claimed he was a prophet, from about 275 AD onward, openly identified Christ with the sun in heaven. So Jesus is identified as the God of the sun as well in this circle. And the Christian bishops of Rome, always more ready than others to assimilate pagan practices and popular beliefs, may have deemed it good policy to take over one which they could not hope to eliminate. Bad strategy, God says in Jeremiah chapter 1. And you're not supposed to do that. Never replicate anything the Gentiles do to worship their gods and your worship of the Father, and obviously, by derivation, the Son. Just so you know, as we progress here, we're going to realize that because we were trying to replicate the pagan worship of God of the sun in the sky, we started to actually re-identify Jesus in ways that went way beyond who he really was to make him more of a god like the God of the sun. And that's why trying to copy the way the worship beliefs were of the Gentiles would actually infect us to try to match them with the same pagan ideas, paganizing Jesus now, suddenly. That's the unfortunate side effect of trying to redeem the day in this case. Note that Chrysostom and Cassian speak of the new feast as that of the birth after or according to the flesh. Was there then an older feast which celebrated the birth of Jesus according to the Spirit? That's what's being lost as well. So not only are we replicating pagan ideas and paganizing Jesus by creating this Christmas concept with all the trappings of it, we're also getting rid of what was the original festival of the church, which is the Epiphany. And this is what Conybeare says. There was, and this was, no other than the feast of the baptism, known to us today as the feast of the Epiphany. The word Epiphany means where you have a word of God is heard by a group of people and audibly. It's an epiphany. Everybody sees or experiences God simultaneously. As to the original significance of this feast, there can be no doubt. Nicetas says that, quote, its principle and cause is the baptism of Christ. So Epiphany had nothing to do directly at first with the birth of Christ at all. It had only to do with the baptism of Christ. Gregory, the wonder worker, writing in the 3rd century, calls it the day of the Holy Theophany. And in this homily, for it speaks only of the baptism of the Lord as being commemorated on it. So Gregory is also confirming what was said by Nicetas, that it's only about the birth and the baptism of Jesus. It's only about the baptism of Jesus and not the birth. Hippolytus, at the beginning of the same century, calls the festival by the same title, and in his homily, for it equally refers to the baptism only. So again, you have 3 sources here that it completely started only about the baptism of Jesus, didn't even have the birth of Jesus yet involved in this scenario. Now, Conybeare is going to provide a footnote 3, and if you go to that, it's going to be Jerome. That's all in Latin over here, so I'm going to translate it. Let's read the introduction in English, though. Jerome, in his commentary on Ezekiel 1, chapter 1, states that the feast of the carnal birth did not properly belong to January 6th. So in other words, the celebration of Jesus' birth, whether December 25th or some other date, never belonged to the purpose of January 6th. So what was the purpose of January 6th? It says this. This is my translation. The day of Epiphany is still venerable, not as some think to be for his birthday in the flesh. For then, at his baptism, he was hidden and not known, which is fitting for this time, when it was said, "This is my beloved Son in whom I'm well pleased." So Jerome is saying, don't mix up January 6th with whatever is going on in Rome at that time. These are two different objects of worship, of basically, or celebration, basically, of the theophany, or the appearance of God, or the epiphany, if you will, the voice of God talking over Jesus at his baptism, this day begotten thee. That is the central key message. Now notice he doesn't remember to tell you it said this day I begotten thee. Why is that? He's the guy who got rid of this day I begotten thee out of the Bible. He was the first one who got rid of it out of the Bible. Latin Vulgate, 405 AD. He's embarrassed by it, so he doesn't want to tell you what it actually said, because he's part of his mission. Apparently, it's him who did it, because there's no other author of the Latin Vulgate of 405 AD but himself. So it's fair to say he's the one who did it. His buddy was Augustine. Augustine obviously had a reason why he wanted it out, to make room for Christmas and other values that were rising, and more important, that we would no longer remember Jesus being born the Son of God at his baptism. We'd have to believe he's an eternal Son of God, and that was the battle that Bishop Faustus was waging against the message that was in the Nicene Creed at the time. It still is. Let's continue. In the West, it is said to have been introduced much later, and Ammianus Marcellinus is the first to mention its existence in Gaul. That's France, modern France. He states that the Emperor Julian kept the feast, Epiphany, there in the year 360 AD. However, it is probable that our ignorance of it at a far earlier date in the West is only due to want of records. The Latin writers of the late 4th century, meaning the late 300s, and of the 5th, 400s, also had a reason for being reticent about the feast, supposing, as is probable, that it existed much earlier. It was commemorative of the Lord's rebirth, and as such had become heretical. So the idea of Jesus being born again and becoming a son of God by the very same way that we're supposed to become sons of God was erased, because that's too challenging to believe that Jesus needed a new birth or a rebirth. But that's how it read. This day of begotten was spoken over his head at the baptism, both in Matthew and Luke. And that's, again, Augustine could not refute that fact, and he admitted it by his response to Bishop Faustus. Now let's continue. Later on, it acquired a new Orthodox content as commemorating the visit of the Magi. So Epiphany will be changed or transformed in some places to include this story about the birth of Christ, the visit of the Magi, and the manifestation of the infant Jesus to the Gentiles. The homilies of Pseudo Maximus, which I quote below, indicate that in the north of Italy it existed at a much earlier date and was called the birthday, Natalis Dies, because on it Jesus was reborn, the Renatus. So he's going back and saying, see, but when it was originally created, it had this concept of being reborn, and therefore it was the Epiphany that was originally known throughout Christendom, not this later version that would have the birth in the flesh. The Armenians, who, as I have said, still keep Christmas or the carnal birth of Jesus, along with his baptism on January 6th, preserve in the controversial literature in which they defended their conservatism against the attacks of the Greeks numerous citations from early Christian writers, which prove, if genuine, that their way of keeping the double feast on one and the same day, January 6th, was early and widespread. So the Armenians would hold to this idea that it's just simply Jesus' rebirth. But the opponents would say, wait, there's early Christian writers that talk about keeping it two ways on January 6th, both the carnal birth, the birth in the flesh, and meaning a true birthday on January 6th, and do the baptism of Jesus as a celebratory focus. So there's this, in other words, there's something battling back and forth to try to say, hey, wait a minute, you need to keep the birth of Christ on January 6th too. So that's going on at the same time. They cite Polycarp. So what is the early church? They cite Polycarp of the first half of the 2nd century, Melito ad Eurotropium in the 2nd, Hippolytus and Cyprian of the first half of the 3rd. Their appeal was always to Luke's gospel. Now this is interesting. wanted to have January 6th represent both the birth of Christ carnally in the flesh as well as Son of God at his baptism. They argued from Luke, and let's listen to their argument from Luke, that both dates should be January 6th. Let's see. Which declares Jesus was beginning his 30th year when he came before John for baptism. This proves, such was their argument, that he was baptized on his 30th birthday. It doesn't say that, so it's an inference or it's a contention. Hence, it is proper to celebrate his baptism and his birth on one and the same day. So Conybeare is summarizing the argument. So that's actually not an unreasonable argument. It's just simply not, well, it's not established directly by Luke itself, Luke's words himself. All right, so now in this next paragraph, Conybeare is going to say there was this movement later to have both the birth of Christ physically and the new birth at the Son of God at the baptism to be celebrated together on January 6th. But he's going to say that wasn't actually the original view of this. So let's listen. It is certain, therefore, that prior to the year 373 AD, when the modern Christmas was introduced at Antioch and Constantinople. So now if you have people claiming he was born on December 25th, this is when the counter position was taken to say that Jesus was born on January 6th to keep the Epiphany feast continuing, okay, and not let it get bled off into this Christmas of December 25th. The earthly or carnal birth of Jesus was already feasted. So as of 373 AD, while the Antioch and Constantinople people were doing the August 25th birth of Christ, they were doing already the carnal birth of Christ at the feasts, but only along with the baptism and not on a separate day by itself. So he's saying this was the pushback, if you will, was to, okay, we'll take on a birth of Christ in our January 6th celebrations, but we're not going to go along with this December 25th thing. So you had a huge dissent against Christmas within Christendom. Then continues. We have seen, however, that the original significance of the Feast of the Epiphany was baptismal, meaning nothing else, no birth of Christ physically. How then shall we explain the fact that in the 4th century, the 300s, before the birth from the Virgin was allotted a day of its own, the 6th of January was regarded at once the birth and the baptismal day of Jesus? So now he's going to try to explain that more depth. All right, so let's take a look at this. Cyril, Bishop of Jerusalem, wrote a letter to Julius, who was the Pope of Rome, AD 337 to 352, so this post-Nicaea. In this, Cyril, the Bishop of Jerusalem, complains of the difficulty experienced at Jerusalem by the faithful in keeping both festivals on the one day. So this is talking about January 6th. Oh, let's do the honoring of Jesus' birth and let's do the honoring of his baptismal regeneration. The birth, he says, had to be celebrated in the cave of the Nativity at Bethlehem and the baptism on the banks of the Jordan. By the way, this reflects the actual evidence was, biblically speaking, that Jesus was born in a cave, not in a manger. And that's another myth that came up later. But the original records were that it was a cave, and that's mentioned in Justin Martyr. Now, Bethlehem is 7 miles south of the Jordan, some 18 east of Jerusalem. So it was hard to travel one to the other. I'm not going to go into more issue there because it gets digressed. But the point is, this discussion reflects the idea that people were, by the time of the 300s, 337, 352, somewhere in there, at Jerusalem, they're trying to keep both the birth of Christ feast and both the rebirth of Christ baptism together on the same day of January 6th, and it's difficult. And they're trying to get a resolution from the Pope to help them. Good luck with that. Anyway, the Church of Jerusalem was too conservative to adopt a new date. So they were being asked to move their date to December 25th for the birth, and they could keep their Epiphany whenever they wanted. But in the year 549, if we may believe Cosmas Indicopleustes, the old date of January 6th was still observed and defended on the ground that St. Luke's narrative of the baptism implied it to be the true one. It implies that at Jerusalem, the feast of the baptism was that which originally pertained to the day, and that it was celebrated by the believers on the banks of the Jordan where John baptized Jesus. The feast at Bethlehem was an embarrassing addition to the older one. It was clearly a new feast. Very blunt. Nor is it in Greek and Armenian sources alone that we meet with the double feast in its older form. So again, this is going back to, there was some tradition where you would have the physical birth celebrated at the same time as the baptismal birth but both on January 6th. There are two Latin homilies variously attributed to Maximus of Turin in the 5th century, that's the 400s, or to Ambrose, who also was late 300s, early 400s, of Milan. He was a bishop in the 4th, the 300s. In these, it is declared that Epiphany was, anyhow, the birthday of the Lord Jesus, whether because he was born of the Virgin on that day or was reborn in baptism. So this concept was still kept, that the Epiphany is still the rebirth of Christ as Son of God. So he's not a God when he's born, no matter how you want to explain the virgin birth. That's not when he became Son of God. He became Son of God here. They'll claim he became a Son of Man at his birth. So there was this distinction being kept. Conybeare will go into that a little bit soon. These homilies attest, moreover, that the election for Epiphany was the gospel not of the earthly birth, but of the baptism, in these words, quote, "The gospel writing, as we have just heard it read, relates that the Lord came to the Jordan for the sake of baptism, and that he wished himself to be consecrated in that river by the heavenly mysteries." To a couple of homilies, he's going to say this. Now in the 4th century, to which no doubt these two North Italian homilies belong, it was already heretical in the 4th century, in the 300s sometimes, in the great Christian centers of Rome, Antioch, and Constantinople, to use such phrases as we find in them, to say, namely, that Jesus was reborn, was regenerated, was sanctified in the Jordan, to speak of the nativity of his Spirit. And he's going to give you an example of where that can be proven. Next, and here we find ourselves in the presence of what is by far the greatest revolution of Christian opinion which has ever occurred, greater far than the Reformation of the 16th century. It was accomplished in different places in different ages, in Rome as early as about 199, in Antioch about 260, in the Balkan Peninsula about 340, in outlying parts of Christendom like Spain and Armenia as late as the 8th to 10th century, in some remote circles of believers in Poland, Russia, Armenia, and the Upper Tigris, it has never been accomplished at all. In other words, the memory of Epiphany always being about the rebirth of Christ, his being made Son of God, being begotten as Son of God at his baptism, existed originally, and the greatest revolution of Christianity wasn't the leap of what was made in the Reformation. It was getting rid of this idea of who Christ really was and what he was about and what his baptism was about and what happened at his baptism. That had to be revolutionarily changed. And so this is the greatest revolution of Christian opinion of all time. All right, I'm going to end it there. It was actually a 40-minute video, and then I decided that's just too long. I try to keep things 30 minutes or less, so we're going to make this 20 minutes. And then if you want to see the rest of this review and quotes of Conybeare, that'll be 20 more minutes. It'll come out in a few hours after I finish producing this one. So God bless. I hope everybody had a wonderful Hanukkah yesterday, who celebrated Hanukkah. And I'm looking forward to now celebrating January 6th as the Epiphany. All right. God bless. Take care. Ciao. Bye.
Give your life to Christ tonight. Let him give you a new heart. Make you a new person. And give you the joy and the peace that you've always longed for. Now, it'll cost you something. It doesn't come cheap. It costs Christ his blood. It costs God his Son. And it'll cost you your sins. He demands that you deny self, take up the cross, take his unpopularity, take your place with him in suffering if need be. But in return, he'll give you a new heart. He'll accept you into his kingdom. He'll forgive the past. He'll make you a new creation.
That was Billy preaching in 1957. His message appeared strong.